Somewhere along a stretch of Iranian coastline, a single structure just went dark. No sirens, no dramatic footage racing across every newsfeed within the hour. Just one tower quietly erased from the coastline, and with it, an entire military's ability to see. Sometimes the most effective thing a military can do isn't the loudest strike of the week. It's taking out the one piece of equipment the other side didn't realize was actually holding their entire strategy together. That's exactly what happened along Iran's southern coast, and it's genuinely one of the more clever moves of this entire war, precisely because of how little attention it initially got compared to the bigger strikes making headlines that same week. A lot of coverage of this war keeps chasing whichever single strike produces the most dramatic footage, and that's understandable, since that's what tends to perform well. But some of the smartest moves in any war are quiet by design, and this is exactly one of those moments. So let's slow down and give it the attention it deserves rather than letting it get buried under headlines. Walking through what actually happened, why this specific target mattered so much more than its size would suggest, and why Iran's own public claims in the days since have started falling apart under basic scrutiny is worth doing properly. Every fact here comes from Central Command's own public statements, cross-checked reporting from multiple outlets, along with Iran's own state media where it's directly relevant to compare claims. Where something is disputed between the two sides, that will be stated clearly rather than picking a winner. Let's start with the target itself, because understanding exactly what it was is the entire key to understanding why the strike mattered. On July 16th, U.S. forces destroyed a surveillance tower at Shahid Kalantari port in the city of Chabahar, on Iran's Gulf of Oman coastline, east of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Central Command confirmed the strike directly in a statement posted to its official account, describing the tower as part of a maritime surveillance network that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had used for decades to track and target commercial vessels transiting the strait. The Secretary of War personally posted a photo of the destroyed tower afterward, and Central Command released 35 seconds of unclassified infrared footage showing the structure disappear inside a violent blast and a rolling plume of smoke. Here's why that specific description, used for decades, matters so much, and why this was a genuinely smart target choice rather than just another strike in a long list. A surveillance tower like this one isn't a weapon in the conventional sense. It doesn't fire anything itself, but it's the eyes at the very start of an entire targeting chain. It finds ships. It fixes their exact position. It tracks their movement over time, and then it feeds all of that information to IRGC commanders who use it to direct missiles, drones, or fast attack boats toward whatever vessel they've decided to target. Defense analysis of the strike put it about as cleanly as it can be described, saying the strike ripped one of the eyes out of the IRGC's maritime attack network. Whatever weapons Iran still has positioned near Hormuz after months of this war, they just lost a long-standing, fully reliable source of surveillance data covering the entire Gulf of Oman approach to the strait. Central Command was blunt about the human stakes involved too, stating directly that destroying this tower degrades the IRGC's ability to coordinate attacks on what it called innocent civilian crew members, tying this strike explicitly to protecting the actual mariners who have been caught in the middle of this conflict for months. Think about the tactical logic here for a second, because it's genuinely elegant. You can spend enormous resources chasing down every individual missile launcher, every fast boat hidden in a coastal cave, every drone site scattered across hundreds of miles of Iranian coastline, and that's exactly what much of this war's targeting has looked like up to this point. Or, alternatively, you can go after the single node that lets Iran actually see where to aim all of those weapons in the first place, destroy the surveillance capability, and every downstream weapon system becomes considerably less effective, even if it survives completely physically intact, because it no longer has reliable real-time data telling it where a target actually is. That's precisely the kind of target selection that produces outsized strategic effect relative to the physical size of what actually got destroyed. And it's a good example of exactly the sort of surgical high-leverage strike that a purely dramatic strike count can't fully capture on its own. There's a useful comparison here to how modern militaries think about targeting more broadly. Anyone who has studied air power doctrine will tell you that the most efficient strikes are rarely the ones that destroy the most physical mass. They're the ones that disable the fewest number of components needed to collapse an entire system's function. Think of it like disabling a car by pulling one specific wire, rather than trying to destroy the whole engine block. The car still looks mostly intact, but it isn't going anywhere. A surveillance tower sitting at the head of a targeting chain is exactly that kind of single point of failure. Every missile battery, every fast boat, every drone launch site downstream of that tower still physically exists after the strike, fully armed and fully capable in isolation. But each of them is now operating with degraded situational awareness about where commercial traffic actually is at any given moment, which meaningfully reduces how effectively Iran can direct any of those remaining assets against a moving target in real time. There's also a genuinely new piece of military technology that entered this specific fight, worth flagging directly because it's easy to miss inside a broader strike announcement. According to Central Command, this operation marked the first time one-way attack sea drones took part in this campaign. That's a real technological shift worth understanding. A one-way attack sea drone is essentially an uncrewed surface vessel packed with explosives and guided toward a target, functioning as a kind of naval equivalent to the one-way attack aerial drones that have become such a defining feature of modern warfare more broadly. Introducing that capability into the naval side of this specific campaign for the first time tells you the U.S. military has been actively expanding its toolkit against Iran's coastal targets throughout this war, rather than simply repeating the same strike profile month after month. It's worth spending a moment on why an uncrewed maritime strike system matters strategically beyond just being an interesting new capability. Sending a manned aircraft or a manned surface vessel into a heavily contested coastal area always carries real risk to the personnel aboard. And that risk shapes how aggressively commanders are willing to operate close to shore, near mines, coastal defenses, and exactly the kind of hidden fast boats this war has spent months trying to root out. An uncrewed system removes that specific constraint. It can be sent closer to shore, into more contested water, accepting a higher risk of loss without any risk to human life, which in turn lets planners be considerably more aggressive about exactly which targets they're willing to go after and how close to Iran's own coastline they're willing to operate. Introducing that capability into the naval side of this campaign, even in a single operation, signals that American commanders are looking for ways to sustain and even increase the tempo of this specific fight without correspondingly increasing the risk to their own people, which is exactly the kind of shift that tends to matter more over the following weeks and months than in the single week it first appears. The broader strike package that included the Chabahar Tower reportedly lasted around 90 minutes altogether, and it coincided directly with the resumption of the American naval blockade against vessels transiting to or from Iranian ports, which Central Command said went into effect that same day. And the blockade enforcement wasn't just a policy statement sitting on paper somewhere either. Central Command released footage showing U.S. Marines conducting a verification boarding aboard a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Oman on the same day as the tower strike. That's the blockade actually functioning in real time, American forces physically boarding and inspecting a specific ship to verify compliance, happening in parallel with the strike that had just blinded a chunk of Iran's coastal surveillance network. Put those two things together, degrading Iran's ability to track and target ships on one hand, while simultaneously and physically enforcing a blockade against Iran's own shipping on the other, and you start to see a genuinely coordinated campaign, rather than a series of disconnected individual strikes. It's worth understanding exactly what a verification boarding like that actually involves, because the term itself undersells how significant an operation this is. It means a team of armed Marines physically leaves their own vessel, crosses open water, and climbs aboard a foreign-flagged commercial ship, inspecting cargo manifests, crew documentation, and the vessel's actual cargo against what it has declared, to determine whether that ship is complying with the blockade or attempting to route goods to or from Iranian ports in violation of it. Every single one of those boardings carries real, non-trivial risk, not just from the possibility of resistance aboard the vessel itself, but from the basic fact that a small team of armed personnel operating far from their own ship, in waters where Iranian fast boats and coastal defenses remain active even after months of strikes, is inherently more exposed than personnel remaining aboard a heavily armed naval vessel. Doing that kind of boarding on the same day as a major strike against Iran's coastal surveillance network is a real demonstration of operational confidence. It tells you American commanders judge the immediate threat environment safe enough to conduct exactly the kind of close-in, personnel-heavy operation that would have been considerably riskier before that surveillance capability got degraded. Now let's talk about the rhetorical fight happening in parallel with all of this physical action, because it's just as important to the overall story, maybe even more revealing about where each side actually stands. Days before the tower strike, Central Command put out a public statement that read almost like a direct rebuttal aimed squarely at Iran's own claims. The statement said plainly that the Strait of Hormuz is open to all vessels seeking to lawfully transit the international waterway, that U.S. forces are positioned and prepared to ensure freedom of navigation remains available despite what it called unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations, and then added two short, blunt lines that capture the entire tone of this specific rhetorical fight. Iran does not control the strait, and traffic is flowing. That statement is worth reading closely because it directly contradicts a separate, competing set of claims Iran had been making around the exact same window. Just days earlier, following an earlier round of U.S. strikes that same week, Iran's IRGC had declared the strait closed entirely, stating it would remain closed until, in their words, the end of U.S. interference in the region. Iranian officials told their own state media that the U.S. military had been trying to create an illegal route through the strait, and Tehran claimed retaliatory attacks against multiple Gulf nations, framing all of it as a direct response to renewed American strikes along its southern coast. So you have two governments making flatly contradictory public claims about the exact same stretch of water at essentially the same moment. Iran insisting the strait is closed and will stay closed until American forces leave the region, and the United States insisting the opposite, that the strait remains open, that Iran doesn't actually control it, and that traffic is moving through it regardless of what Tehran says. That's not a minor disagreement over interpretation. It's two governments each publicly asserting a version of physical reality that directly excludes the other's version. And that specific contradiction is actually the most useful lens for understanding just how unusually confident this specific stretch of the war's American messaging has become. Not because either side did something wildly reckless in a purely tactical sense, but because the sheer confidence of the American statement, following almost immediately on the heels of Iran's own closure declaration, represents a level of open public defiance that's fairly unusual, even by this war's already escalated standards. The kind of statement that essentially dares the other government to prove otherwise in front of a watching world, rather than simply asserting a competing claim and letting the two versions sit unresolved side by side, the way so much of this conflict's public messaging has tended to unfold up to this point. There's an even more direct example of that same dynamic playing out just one day after the tower strike. And it's genuinely the clearest illustration of an Iranian claim getting caught unprepared in real time. Following that same wave of strikes, the IRGC claimed it had attacked a U.S. Special Operations Command Center at Al-Tanf in Syria, and separately claimed to have captured or killed American soldiers there in retaliation. Iran also claimed it had struck a U.S. radar station in Oman during the same window. Central Command's response was about as direct a public rebuttal as you're likely to see in this entire conflict, stating flatly and immediately, fact, no U.S. troops in the region have recently been killed or captured. That's not diplomatic hedging or careful no comment. That's an explicit, on-the-record denial of a specific enemy claim, issued within the same news cycle the claim itself was made. A separate military source on the ground in Syria told wire service reporters that Iran had carried out some kind of attack near Al-Tanf, but that it had not actually hit the base itself, an account that could not be independently verified, but that at least partially splits the difference between the two governments' competing versions of what happened. Whether Iran's Al-Tanf claim was a deliberate fabrication meant to project strength domestically, a case of internal misinformation moving up through IRGC command channels, or some genuine but wildly exaggerated version of a minor incident, the fact that American forces felt confident enough to shoot it down this quickly and this bluntly tells you something real about how unprepared, or at least how sloppy, Iran's public messaging apparatus has become at exactly the moment its own physical capabilities were also visibly being degraded along the coast. It's worth being fair and balanced about the other side of this specific claim too, because Iranian state media didn't fully cave on every detail. Iran's official news agency actually confirmed the destruction of the maritime control tower at Chabahar port after the U.S. strike, which is itself notable. Tehran didn't try to deny that the tower itself had been hit, but that same reporting pushed back specifically on the broader scope of the damage, stating that the port's berths, cargo handling equipment, and other operational infrastructure remained unaffected by the strike. That's actually a pretty reasonable, credible-sounding rebuttal on Iran's part. A targeted strike against a specific surveillance tower wouldn't necessarily be expected to damage unrelated port infrastructure sitting elsewhere on the same site, and there's no obvious reason to doubt that specific claim the way there's reason to doubt the Al-Tanf story. That distinction matters, because it shows Iran's state media wasn't uniformly unreliable in the aftermath of this specific week. It selectively confirmed what was true, the tower's destruction, while pushing back on what would have been an exaggeration, broader port damage, and separately put out what increasingly looks like an outright fabrication regarding Al-Tanf. Sorting through which parts of any government's wartime claims hold up and which don't is exactly the kind of careful work that gets skipped by coverage chasing the loudest possible framing, and it's worth doing properly here. This is actually a really useful case study, if you step back from it for a second, in how to read wartime claims from any government more generally, not just in this specific conflict. The pattern here is almost a template. A claim about physical damage that's independently verifiable, like a tower being destroyed, tends to get confirmed by both sides, because denying something that obviously happened only costs credibility for no benefit. A claim about the broader scope or significance of that damage, like whether an entire port's operations were affected, is where you start seeing genuine spin, each side shading the description toward whatever framing serves its narrative without necessarily crossing into outright fabrication. And then a claim about something considerably harder to independently verify in real time, like an alleged attack on a specific facility in a third country with alleged casualties, is exactly where you're most likely to see either significant exaggeration or outright invention, precisely because it's the hardest category of claim for outside observers to quickly check against physical evidence. Recognizing which category any specific claim falls into, verified physical fact, spun interpretation, or hard-to-verify assertion, is genuinely one of the most useful skills for following a war like this one without getting whipsawed by whichever side's messaging happens to reach you first on any given day. Let's zoom out and think about what this specific week actually tells you about the broader trajectory of the fight over the strait. Because this isn't really about one single dramatic action, it's about a pattern that's been building for a while. This war's effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz technically dates back to March 19th, when the United States began a sustained aerial campaign specifically aimed at destroying Iranian naval vessels and drones threatening shipping through the waterway. Following Iran's initial closure of the strait on February 28th, the same day the broader war started, with the strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader. Since then, there has been a naval blockade imposed in mid-April, a brief pause called Operation Project Freedom in early May, ongoing strikes throughout the summer, and reporting from the Congressional Research Service noting that Iran's actual ability to mine or otherwise close the strait may have been substantially degraded by the cumulative weight of American and Israeli operations targeting exactly this kind of infrastructure since the war's opening days. The human cost across this entire campaign has been real too, with tracked casualties including at least one tugboat sunk, more than a dozen merchant ships damaged, several abandoned outright, 2 merchant ships captured, and a dozen seafarers killed or missing, plus a port worker killed and 2 others wounded in a separate incident in Bahrain. So the Chabahar Tower strike isn't really a standalone moment. It's the latest, and arguably one of the more cleverly targeted entries in a 5-month campaign that's been grinding forward the entire time. It's worth pausing on those cumulative casualty figures for a second, rather than just listing them and moving on, because they represent real people whose lives have been directly reshaped by a conflict. Most of them have no personal stake in whatsoever. A dozen seafarers killed or missing over the course of this campaign means a dozen families who've spent months not knowing, or knowing the worst, about someone who was simply doing a job moving cargo through a waterway that happened to become a war zone. Merchant crews aboard vessels transiting the strait come from dozens of different countries, and none of them signed up to be caught in the middle of a dispute between Washington and Tehran. Every strike, every blockade enforcement action, every surveillance tower taken offline in this campaign is ultimately being justified, at least in the official American framing, as protective of exactly those people. And it's worth holding Central Command's own stated rationale for the Chabahar strike, protecting innocent civilian crew members, against that actual human backdrop rather than treating it as pure rhetorical flourish. What actually makes this particular entry stand out is the combination of 3 things happening essentially simultaneously. A genuinely high leverage target choice that degrades Iran's entire targeting chain rather than just one weapon system. The introduction of a brand new capability, one-way attack sea drones, into this specific fight for the first time. And a rhetorical environment where American officials are now willing to flatly and immediately contradict specific Iranian claims in real time, rather than letting them sit unanswered. Taken together, that combination suggests a level of operational and informational confidence on the American side that's noticeably different from earlier phases of this war, when Iranian claims about strikes and retaliation tended to circulate for longer before facing this kind of immediate specific pushback. It is worth pausing on why the Chabahar Tower specifically became a repeated target across this stretch of the war, rather than a single one-time strike. Reporting on this exact facility notes that this was actually the 3rd time a U.S. strike had hit the tower, or its surrounding infrastructure, over the span of roughly a week, a detail that adds an important layer to the story. Repeatedly striking the same node, rather than simply moving on to the next target on a broader list, suggests American planners considered this specific piece of infrastructure important enough to keep destroying it even after earlier strikes had already presumably degraded its function. That pattern mirrors something seen elsewhere in this war, where certain especially valuable choke points in Iran's coastal infrastructure keep reappearing on strike lists precisely because Iran keeps trying to restore them, and each restoration attempt becomes its own subsequent target. A single strike against a piece of infrastructure tells you it mattered once. A 3rd strike against the same location tells you both sides consider it valuable enough to keep contesting, Iran valuable enough to rebuild, and the United States valuable enough to keep destroying. It is also worth thinking through what this specific moment reveals about how the broader diplomatic track and the military campaign have continued running in parallel throughout this stretch of the war, rather than one replacing the other. Reporting from the same window notes that a memorandum intended to formally end the conflict was expected to be signed within days of this exact strike, even as the strike itself was actively degrading Iran's coastal military infrastructure. That juxtaposition, an active bombing campaign continuing in the same days that diplomats were reportedly finalizing language for a formal end to hostilities, is not actually a contradiction once you understand how this war has functioned from its earliest weeks. Military pressure and diplomatic negotiation have run on separate but connected tracks throughout this entire conflict, with battlefield developments shaping the terms each side is willing to accept at the table, and diplomatic timelines occasionally shaping which targets get prioritized in a given strike package. A surveillance tower degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the days immediately before a memorandum addressing exactly that issue was expected to be finalized is not an accident of timing. It reflects the same coercive logic that has defined this entire war from its opening build-up onward, applying maximum pressure specifically in the window immediately preceding a critical negotiating moment, precisely to strengthen the negotiating position that pressure is meant to support. There is also a broader signal buried in the specific choice of language Central Command used when describing this strike as protecting freedom of navigation for all vessels, except those attempting to violate the ongoing naval blockade. That phrasing does two things simultaneously that are worth separating out. It frames the strike explicitly as protective rather than purely punitive, tying it directly to the safety of commercial shipping and merchant crews, rather than presenting it simply as damage inflicted on an adversary. And it draws a sharp, explicit line between vessels operating within the rules the United States has established and vessels attempting to violate them, effectively announcing in advance which category of ship can expect continued interference and which can expect continued protection. That kind of explicit public rule setting, rather than simply enforcing a blockade quietly and letting its practical effects speak for themselves, is itself a form of psychological pressure, aimed as much at shaping expectations among international shipping companies, weighing whether to attempt transit as it is aimed at Iran directly. I want to be careful here about what isn't being claimed because a title promising something dramatic is tempted to overreach. This isn't saying the Strait of Hormuz is now fully, permanently open in some clean, settled sense. Both governments are still making competing claims about its actual status, and the shipping industry's own risk assessments have continued to show real caution even during periods when American officials have declared the strait functionally open. This also isn't saying Iran's entire coastal surveillance and strike network has been eliminated. A single tower, however significant, is one node in what Central Command itself described as a wider coastal network, meaning other surveillance assets almost certainly still exist along that coastline, even with this specific piece gone. It's also worth being honest that a strike this precisely targeted, however clever the underlying logic, doesn't undo 5 months of a war that's already produced real casualties on every side, real economic disruption to global shipping, and a diplomatic standoff that shows no clean sign of resolving anytime soon. One well-chosen strike against one surveillance node is a genuine tactical win, and it's a legitimate example of American forces adapting their approach in a smart way as this war has dragged on. But it exists inside a much larger, still unresolved conflict, and it would be a mistake to treat any single week's headline, however satisfying the framing, as evidence that the broader war is meaningfully closer to ending than it was the week before. What this specific strike does represent is a smart, high-leverage target choice, that a new naval strike capability entered this fight for the first time this week, and that Iran's own public claims took a real, documented hit to their credibility within about 24 hours of that strike, when Central Command flatly denied the Al-Tanf claim in a way that's noticeably more direct than how this war's rhetorical battles have typically played out up to this point. If you want to actually track where this specific thread goes next, here's what's worth watching. Whether Central Command identifies and strikes additional nodes in that same wider coastal surveillance network, Iran has relied on for decades, because a pattern of systematically dismantling that entire network, rather than just this one tower, would be the clearest sign this specific approach is becoming a deliberate strategy rather than a one-off clever strike. Whether one-way attack sea drones show up again in future operations, and how their role expands, because a technology used for the first time in a single operation often becomes a much larger part of the toolkit in the weeks that follow once its effectiveness gets proven in the field. Whether there are further instances of Central Command directly and immediately rebutting specific Iranian claims the way it did with the Al-Tanf story, because a pattern of fast, specific denials would tell you the American side has decided that letting Iranian claims sit unanswered, even briefly, carries real costs worth actively countering, and how shipping industry risk assessments actually respond to all of this, because ultimately, the people whose literal job is pricing danger in this specific waterway are a more honest barometer of what's actually changed on the ground than any single government's public statement, however confident that statement sounds. A couple more things worth adding to that list. Whether Iran attempts to rebuild or relocate its coastal surveillance capability in response to this strike, since a network that's operated for decades doesn't simply disappear from Iranian military planning just because one node was destroyed, and evidence of reconstruction or dispersal to harder-to-strike locations would tell you Tehran considers this specific capability important enough to rebuild despite the risk of it being targeted again. And how quickly, if at all, Iran's own state media walks back or quietly drops the Al-Tanf claim in the coming days, because a claim that simply fades away without further mention, rather than being actively defended or clarified, is itself a pretty reliable signal that it didn't hold up even by Tehran's own internal standards. It is also worth noting the IRGC Navy's own public warning issued around this same window, in which it stated that American forces were drawing closer to what it called the 0 hour for a potential Iranian military operation against Central Command naval units in regional waters, with Iranian state television carrying the claim that American vessel movements and equipment were under active surveillance by Iran's own naval forces. Whether that specific warning reflected genuine operational intent or was primarily rhetorical, aimed at reasserting a sense of continued capability and initiative at exactly the moment its own surveillance infrastructure was being dismantled, is difficult to determine with confidence from the outside. But the timing itself is worth noting. A public threat of pending naval action against American forces issued in the same general window that the specific surveillance capability Iran would need to actually execute and coordinate such an operation was in the process of being struck. That juxtaposition, a threat of action paired with the degradation of the infrastructure that threat would depend on, is consistent with the broader pattern already established here. A government continuing to project confidence and capability publicly, even as the specific tools underpinning that capability were visibly eroding in real time. A headline promising something dramatic and an enemy caught completely unprepared is built to make you think you already understand the whole story before taking a closer look. The real version here is more precise and arguably more genuinely interesting than that framing suggests. A well-chosen strike against a decades-old surveillance node, a new weapon system entering the fight for the first time, and a rhetorical environment where one side's specific claims are now getting shot down in near real time rather than lingering unanswered for days. That's not spectacle. That's a war that's gotten noticeably more precise and more confident on one particular side over the course of just the last week or two. A real tactical win, alongside a real, still unresolved, wider war, which is ultimately more useful to understand than either extreme framing on its own.